During his 1974 Australian tour, Cranky Frankie went head-on with the local press.
They're pimps. They're just crazy, you know, and the hookers. The broads who work in the press are the hookers of the press. Need I explain that to you?
Stand back, please. Please, stand back.
Can we just have a word to Mr. Sinatra?
Sinatra's bodyguards then brutally assaulted news cameramen during scuffles outside his hotel.
You bastard! Who the bloody hell do you think you are?
This led to one of the world's biggest entertainment scandals. He was black banned by the unions and trapped in Australia. Frank Sinatra was under siege.
Sinatra, you're a millionaire in your own right. Is it worth your while to come out here for what you're doing? A short trip like this?
I don't think finances have anything to do with it at all. I think it's a matter of just getting around as much as I can.
It was 1974. Frank Sinatra was traveling the globe, staging a comeback, and Australia was on his list.
When we announced the tour, it sold out right away. People had been waiting a long time to see Frank Sinatra.
Sinatra's show business career was legendary. A multi-Oscar and Grammy Award winner, he was friends of presidents, kings and queens. Entertainment royalty, a big leaguer who was extremely powerful and almost untouchable. One of the richest entertainers of his time, his playboy lifestyle and alleged mafia connections attracted the attention of the world's media. He hated the scandalous nature of the tabloid press. They were more interested in who he slept with than his singing ability.
We were told there was to be no interviews, there was to be no press conference, there would be no direct access between the media and Sinatra.
Hungry for a story, the Aussie press didn't take no for an answer. They hounded Sinatra. Wherever he went, they pursued him.
Welcome to Melbourne, Mr. Sinatra. Welcome to Melbourne.
After 3 days, Sinatra had had enough. Taking to the stage, he let fly with a sexually charged attack against the press. And later that evening, his heavies assaulted 2 news cameramen. The fans, unions and press were outraged.
I thought if he puts this headlock on and he's stronger, he's going to break me neck, because it was absolutely a killer.
Normally what happens is security boys play the game, we play the game. They know we're trying to get a story. They know that they're going to have to try and keep us away. And normally there's a thin grey line, if you like, that we keep each side of it. But, you know, last night was just totally freaked me right out.
What are the rights of these thugs and personal bodyguards when they're hired?
No rights whatsoever. No rights.
No right to punch a cameraman?
They have no rights to break the law of this state.
Sinatra found himself black banned by the unions, trapped in Australia and under siege in a hotel room until he apologized.
We could get no fuel, no transport. We were trapped.
It was 5 days of international controversy involving press, politicians, unions, and one of the world's most famous stars.
I said to him, well, as far as I know, there's only one case been recorded in the history of someone walking on water. And unless Frank is going to be the second one, I don't understand how you're going to get out.
Our story was, how is this going to end? I mean, he's black banned, unions are not going to touch him, he can't get fuel, he can't fly out of the country. So what's going to happen?
We'll set the record straight, including the original recording of his controversial monologue and never-seen-before footage of Sinatra's heavies assaulting 2 news cameramen. How did Frank Sinatra turn a nation against him? And how did it all end? Frank Sinatra arrived at Sydney's Mascot Airport on July 7th and occupied the entire 23rd floor of Sydney's Boulevard Hotel.
When he arrived, he had his entourage with him. He had Barbara Marx, who was later to become his wife. He had his manager and attorney, a guy called Milton Rudin, but his nickname was Mickey. He had a guy called Gilly Rizzo, who was a man in those days, probably in his early 60s, but built like a proverbial outhouse, very big and very strong. And he was a close personal friend and also a pseudo bodyguard. You know, he was always with him.
For any artist, not just Frank Sinatra, to come to Australia was, in those days, a giant trip, the longest one you could take anywhere in the world. So we had to do a little bit extra. When we actually got to the airport in Sydney on arrival, I had arranged for a white Rolls-Royce and 6 white Mercedes-Benz limousines. Frank looked around and he looked at this line of cars and he said to me, "Now that's class." A very Frank Sinatra comment, I might say.
No expense was spared for old Blue Eyes. Sydney rolled out the red carpet.
I said, "Is there any special needs I can do for Mr. Sinatra?" They said, "Well, he likes to cook. Can you get us a suite with a kitchen?" And I said, "Well, we don't have any suites with kitchens, but leave it with me." So we took an adjoining suite and we literally built a kitchen in it for him. And of course, when I showed him up to the suite and then to this brand new, everything in it kitchen, he was very much impressed.
Frank Sinatra may have been impressed by the Aussie hospitality, but not by the local press.
It may be that Frank had a wee bit of sensitivity about the Australian media, but I don't think he had any more than sensitivity he had about all media. He hated them, wouldn't talk to them anywhere. It was very Frank, very mafiosi, it was very my way.
His PR people just said no interviews. The concerts were a sellout. He didn't like the press, and that was it.
They chased us into town, and then when we got to this hotel, on every corner there was a camera crew. And we had to go in through the back and come in through the laundry entrance out the back of the hotel to avoid the press.
I was there to meet them straight up in the elevator to the 23rd floor where the presidential suite was.
I had 2 security guys on the floor, so anybody that could try to come out of the escalator couldn't get into the floor. We had the whole floor locked off. In fact, we had 2 floors locked off. But, you know, the media is a rule unto themselves today as they were then, and you just can't stop them sometimes.
Can we help you, gentlemen? You're not going to get through the door up there, really.
Well, can we at least try?
Well, if you want to. Hey. Gentlemen, stop. Which way? We're not going to get any further. So.
Well, why is that? Can we...
We're not. You're trespassing. You're trespassing, gentlemen.
May we...
Sorry.
And then it became a bit of a cat and mouse game, which just escalated.
You can imagine a few young reporters having a drink after work. You know, who does he think he is? Well, let's go and greet him. And that was the beginning where he got pissed off that a few young reporters in Sydney didn't show respect.
True to his word, Sinatra dodged the press for 2 days, hiding out in his hotel room. By day 3, the press were frustrated with Sinatra, and they decided to take matters into their own hands. They hunted him in a high-speed car chase towards Sydney's mascot airport.
Well, I'd gone down to Melbourne earlier, and they were coming down in the private jet, and the plan was to go from the airport at Tullamarine in those days to directly to the festival hall for the sound check with the orchestra. Keeping in mind this was going to be our very first show in Australia. And the media had been very earnest, at least, in their efforts to catch Frank.
Sinatra dodged the media and boarded his private jet. The constant battle with the Sydney press was exhausting. The situation was about to get a whole lot worse.
I was working also for an afternoon television current affairs program as well as the news service on Channel 9. We were aware that there was to be no interview. We were aware that we were to have no access to Sinatra. So really we were looking for ways to come up with a story about Sinatra to satisfy the viewing public.
Sinatra was unaware the driver of his car had conspired with a clever Melbourne journalist who was waiting to penetrate his security.
What we decided to do was to hire a car identical to those that were being used as a fleet for his entourage. I was to don a fur coat and a pair of big sunglasses, puff the hair up to try and look like a blonde Barbara Marx or a member of his, inner circle. We sat outside the security gates of Tullamarine Airport waiting for that fleet of cars to come out. Sinatra's car came out first. We were aware of what the car looked like and who the driver was. We had a nod from the driver who we'd spoken to prior to Sinatra arriving, and we skipped in behind that car in a gap that had been created in the fleet.
I actually got out there late, and they'd already left the tarmac before I got there and had headed back into town.
Sinatra and his entourage took off down Tullamarine Freeway, travelling at 100 miles an hour. In hot pursuit were a string of hungry journalists attempting to capture a glimpse of the king for their local rag. Jarvis and her crew managed to stay inside the police escort, directly behind Sinatra's car.
When we arrived at Festival Hall, there were 2 cars only in our small group, and Sinatra's car was required to do a U-turn to come back into a small caged-off enclosure which would keep him separated from a waiting throng of media at the front entrance. As it turned out, when the 2 cars did a turn, we finished up in front of Sinatra's car, and a dear little chap on the gate of the security fence waved us in to this paddock.
The person who was driving Frank and Barbara didn't know where the entrance was, so he actually pulled up out the front, where it had "Tonight, Frank Sinatra."
So he was none too happy as he had to get out of his car. He then had to walk up a long, narrow passageway to the rear of Festival Hall, which we were able to follow him along because we were inside this wire fence.
And so he had to run along the footpath. Some of them were sort of shoving microphones into his chest and into his face as he was trying to sort of hastily get to the stage door. I mean, it was a Keystone Cops, frankly. It was ridiculous. But it wasn't that different to what was going on in Sydney. It had been much the same. It's just got worse in Melbourne.
We were told there was to be no interviews, there was to be no press conference, there would be no direct access between the media and Sinatra. So you can imagine, in a country starved of personalities and starved of big stars, that was a source of frustration to most of the media outlets.
When I first went to Beverly Hills to see if we could get him to come to Australia, Patty Mostyn, who was doing the publicity for my company, she said to me, "Whatever you do, you must make sure, Robert, that he talks to the media." She knew better than I did that if Frank didn't expose himself properly to the media, they would take a position which would be sort of anti-Frank Sinatra, which of course is what happened.
Sinatra had grown tired of the local press, and Frankie was now cranky. He declared war. Australian tour, Frank Sinatra refused to talk to the media. No interviews and no photographs. With no access to Sinatra, the local press were forced to create stories, often giving them a negative spin.
Just how much will the King be getting for his 2 concerts in Melbourne? Well, all the promoters will say is that it's a hefty figure. But one thing's for sure, 2 floors of a hotel, a luxury car, and an almost rebuilding campaign here at Festival Hall certainly can't be paid for with peanuts. Perhaps that's why the seats for the concerts are $20 each.
When he arrived in Melbourne on the day of his first concert, a clever local journalist infiltrated his cavalcade, chasing him to Festival Hall. It was clear the press would give Sinatra no privacy, and his patience was wearing thin. Sinatra had started to push back, and the situation would soon spiral out of control. Under constant surveillance by the press, a furious Sinatra finished his rehearsal and checked into the 15th floor of the Southern Cross Hotel.
And again, out the front of the hotel was lots of cameras and press people all waiting, sort of like piranha or something, you know?
Welcome to Melbourne, Mr. Sinatra. Welcome to Melbourne. Hope you enjoy your stay, gentlemen.
It wasn't the kind of harassment that goes on from press today, paparazzi, towards celebrities today. Totally different feel. I mean, I guess it can look like that, but it wasn't the motive at the time.
Well, that was the entrance of Frank Sinatra to Melbourne, the singer that's made world headlines for not being particularly friendly. How long have you been waiting to see Frank Sinatra?
Since 1 o'clock this afternoon.
You think the wait's been worthwhile? You know he just came in through a side entrance.
Yes, I think it's rotten.
Why is it?
He done the same before when he was out there. He snuck in sideways. No one had a chance to see him, and I think an entertainer of his calibre should come down and see some of his public at least.
The Australian media, and it's been a great strength, and it was certainly very strong in those days, that if something happens that they feel they need to question somebody about, then they will not hesitate to pursue the story until they feel that they've got a decent answer on it.
Good morning. Is this Mr. Sinatra's floor?
That's correct, but Mr. Sinatra instructed no one allowed up.
And there's very strict security?
Very strict, yes.
Will this be the tightest security you've ever worked on?
I would say so, definitely.
Getting out of the hotel to go to the show that evening was tough. Fortunately, the hotel security kept them out of the lobby at the Southern Cross. It wasn't until we actually had to go out the outdoors where the media had made it clear to the hotel that they were entitled to be, and they shoved and pushed.
Stand back, please. Please, stand back.
Can we just have a word to Mr. Sinatra? Sorry. Can we please have a word to Mr. Sinatra?
We've been instructed not to.
We just want a quick word with Mr. Sinatra, that's all. I'm sorry.
When can we get a word? What are you carrying on?
Jilly was supposedly punching people up and all this silly stuff. It was the other way around, in all honesty. I mean, everything was completely turned around by the media and turned into a circus.
This scuffle left a journalist injured, his camera pushed into his face. After 3 days of harassment, Sinatra and his entourage had had enough. The press continued to stalk Sinatra on his way to Festival Hall. They were relentless in their efforts to land a story. But it was time for old Blue Eyes to take the stage. The fans were ready. This was the moment Australia had been waiting for.
I've got you under my skin. I've got you deep in the heart of...
He just came out to a standing ovation with everybody in Melbourne in a black tie, virtually. It was so swish, and I think everybody felt the chill and the excitement. I mean, I have goosebumps just thinking back on it right now, talking to you about it. It was amazing.
Sinatra sang his opening numbers and then delivered his traditional monologue, a chance to talk with his audience. But this time, he took the opportunity to vent his frustration with the local press. It was a catalyst for a chain reaction of disastrous events.
We've been having a marvelous time being chased around the country for the 3 days. You know, we have a name in the States for their counterparts. They're called parasites, because they take and take and take and never give. Absolutely never give. I don't care what you think about any press in the world. I say they're bums, and they're always going to be bums, every one of them. It's the scandal man that really bugs you, drives you crazy. It's two-bit type work that they do. They're pimps. They're just crazy, you know. And the hookers, the broads who work in the press are the hookers of the press. Need I explain that to you? I might offer them $1.50. I'm not sure. I once gave a chick in Washington $2, and I overpaid her, I found out.
If he'd stopped before he mentioned the broads are hookers, he's talking about media, women reporters, and broads, and they're all hookers, and they don't bathe. And it was at that stage the audience response sort of changed a bit.
There was no recording that anybody at the time was aware of that monologue on stage. The people who were at the concert heard it, and that was then reported in the press the next day. You have to understand that Australia in the 1970s was still very conservative in its attitudes. Words like hooker and pimp were to middle blue-collar Australia quite insulting.
After the show, Sinatra returned to the Southern Cross Hotel. Waiting for him outside was an angry throng of press, demanding answers.
I was assigned to the Southern Cross with David Hill and 2 other camera crews. David Hill thought that Frank wouldn't go in the front entrance, so he said to me, would you go down the sideway and wait there just in case he comes in that way? I was around there for about 15 minutes, I suppose, and this big black limousine pulled up. And I thought, oh, wow, here's Frank, I've got him at long last, you know. So I switched the portable light on I had and started filming. And a guy jumped out of the driver's seat and raced over and got a headlock on me. I thought, God, what's this, you know? The next thing I know, the guy from the other side of the car raced across and started trying to pull the camera out of my hand. But I wouldn't let it go, of course.
Right. Filming? Got him? Get him for assault. Good, beauty. And another one. You bastard! Who the bloody hell do you think you are? Touch that bloody camera, boy!
Like, I thought if he puts this headlock on any stronger, he's going to break me neck, because it was absolutely a killer. I could hardly breathe, I could hardly do anything.
This scuffle left 2 cameramen badly injured with facial cuts and bruises. Local unions were outraged, and Australian journalists took it as a professional attack. The next morning, the repercussions began to surface.
Well, I think both journalism and prostitution are proper professions for women. However, I feel sorry for journalists because they have to have something to do with people like Mr. Sinatra, while prostitutes can choose their clients.
Was it real viciousness in it, or? Well, I've been covering news in Melbourne for about 8 years, and we've done all the demonstrations and all the strikes, and I've never seen an attack like this on a television crew.
If 3 of you had 30 seconds with Mr. Sinatra now, what would you tell him?
I'd tell him I'd give him $1.50 for an interview because I think that's what it's worth.
It was now day 4, a day that would change the way the world saw Sinatra forever.
This is just not done in Australia. The mafia might be able to do it in the United States. They do anything over there, but it certainly doesn't happen in Australia, and our union just won't tolerate it happening to our members, and that's the end of it. Chap could have bone damage to his face. Another chap has bruises to his ribs.
What are the rights of these thugs and personal bodyguards when they're hired?
No rights whatsoever. No rights.
No right to punch a cameraman?
They have no rights to break the law of this state. And I tell you now, and through you to the people of Victoria, that if people of that sort come into this country, they've got to abide by the law.
It was 4 days since Sinatra's arrival, but his nightmare had just begun. The Australian unions retaliated. They placed a black ban on him, ordering an immediate apology. His remaining concerts were cancelled. He was now under siege in a hotel room and trapped in Australia.
A black ban is when you put out a decree that no union member will go near this job or person or whatever. If the union declared something to be black, unionists wouldn't touch it.
The hotel had been told by their unions that they weren't allowed to service the room. There was no room service. There was no, nobody could work the lifts.
There'd never been an individual black ban, to the best of my knowledge, to any one individual.
And to not have access to food, drinks, we could get no fuel, no transport. We were trapped. And everybody, including yours truly, were worried about where was this leading to, what was going to happen next.
Unionism was pretty much compulsory, and any time they wanted anything at all, on the wharves or what have you, they would just down tools, go on strike.
It was very much a shop steward type of union environment. So yes, they were powerful, and they liked to have a say.
I think to a large extent the event that happened with Frank Sinatra really was a moment in time where the unions, for the first time in an awful long time, had strength that they had not had before.
With a black ban, no trade union member could provide a service to Sinatra. He couldn't leave the country by air or sea, nor could he refuel his private jet. As all union members had gone on strike, the black ban forced the cancellation of Sinatra's remaining concerts. The fans were furious.
You were very angry then?
Oh, of course we are. We've come a long way. Too far to come, you know, to not see him. Very disappointed, yes.
And who do you blame the cancellation on?
On the journalist union, apparently.
We put to him a proposal that he apologise publicly for his statements last night and personally apologise to Rick Hill's members and our own members who were taken on by his bullies last night.
Somebody in the AJA had it in their mind somewhere that they were going to try and get Frank Sinatra, and this is how the whole thing began.
As far as we're concerned, we're supporting the Australian Journalists Association and the Ethereal Employees Association. Now, if Mr Sinatra makes us an apology acceptable to both those organisations, well, that's okay as far as we're concerned.
There were a number of union leaders who enjoyed a little bit of notoriety, particularly in the press and media at the time, and I think this was an event waiting to happen.
The Australian trade unions may have imposed a black ban on Sinatra, but had they carefully considered their demands? Frank was a man not to be messed with. As one of the world's greatest entertainers, he had powerful friends.
Frank said to Mickey, "Get Hank on the phone." And I didn't know who Hank was, but it turned out to be Henry Kissinger. And Frank gets on the phone, and basically they told him what was going on here.
Sinatra was used to getting his own way. You have to remember that at this time of his career, he could call the President of the United States and get through. He was not accustomed to being holed up in a little hick hotel in Melbourne, Australia, because of a few union reps.
And they were talking about ringing up Jimmy Hoffa, who was head of the Teamsters Union, which was the most powerful union, reported to be mafia-controlled, and having them black ban Qantas in retaliation to what was going on here. Now, if that had happened, I mean, you can imagine if all the Qantas flights out of America were refused takeoff, the same thing as what was happening to Sinatra here.
There's always been stories about Sinatra's mafia connections, and the stories in America were always that the mafia was well connected to the unions. So I suspect there might have been a few phone calls from the American union leaders to the Australian union leaders.
This is just not done in Australia. The mafia might be able to do it in the United States. They do anything over there, but it certainly doesn't happen in Australia, and our union just won't tolerate it happening to our members, and that's the end of it.
By mid-afternoon, both sides were thinking about their next move. The situation was clearly out of control. Union leaders met with Frank Sinatra's tour managers to discuss a formal apology, but negotiations ended in stalemate, neither side giving in.
We got a reply from Sinatra that he would only... that we could apologise to him in 15 minutes or he'd go home.
It was clear a powerful negotiator was needed to put a stop to this madness. Enter Bob Hawke, a man who later became the Australian Prime Minister.
Well, I was the head of the trade union movement, and as the head of the trade union movement was requested by the unions concerned to handle the matter. I always did if there was something big, and I did that.
Bob Hawke was a very powerful man. He was the head of the ACTU, the governing body of the unions, and they say he was the second most powerful man next to the Prime Minister, but in point of fact, everyone felt he was the most powerful man in Australia because the unions literally control the country.
Nothing had been resolved. He was taking the view that he would not apologise. He'd never apologised to anyone in his life, and he wasn't going to start now. And so there was a total impasse.
I suspect it was a battle of egos. at the time. I suspect that there were union leaders involved in the early discussions who felt that they weren't being respected to the level that they should have been.
I don't think they're bullying Sinatra. They probably would have felt that it was the other way around.
I think there was general support from the Australian people for the stand that was taken by the unions. They didn't like the idea of some international celebrity coming in and having his hoods push people around and physically injuring them. That's not the Australian way of doing things.
For the things surrounding the entertainment world today, it must have only been described as exciting. We've had everything, including bomb threats, and some of them came to Channel 9. One man rang early today and said that if we went to Festival Hall tonight, we'd hear a big bang. Well, I think the final bang has probably come from Sinatra. In requesting his apology from the press, he described their treatment of him as 15 years of, quote, shit. Gail Jarvis for National 9 News.
By now, the man that doesn't apologise was fed up. Sinatra had enough fuel in his jet to reach Sydney, so he fled the Southern Cross Hotel for Tullamarine Airport.
It was decided then that Hawke would try and set up a meeting with Sinatra out at the airport.
But by the time Bob Hawke arrived, Sinatra had disobeyed air traffic control and boarded his plane ready for takeoff.
We got a message from the flight controller that Frankie's team said Mr. Sinatra wasn't going to wait any longer to meet Mr. Hawke, and we're taking off to Sydney. And so off they went into the night, leaving Hawke and Donovan standing there, wondering what may have been.
He really wanted to see you, did he? Well, I don't know. How can I tell? I didn't speak to him. I was just assured by the promoter and that he would see me.
Did you get the impression he did want to apologise?
Well, I couldn't get any impression because I didn't speak to him.
Sinatra may have beaten the Black Band, but he insulted one of the most powerful men in Australia. With no means of refuelling his jet, Hawke knew Sinatra wasn't going far, and he booked a flight to Sydney.
You had an international superego meeting Australian national superego, and they were both going to be probably going at it hammer and tongs.
And I said to him, well, as far as I know, there's only one case been recorded in the history of someone walking on water. And unless Frank is going to be the second one, I don't understand how you're going to get out, because you're not going to get out on a ship and you're not going to get out in an aeroplane. So I believe you're here, and you're here until you apologise.
They're just crazy, you know, and the hookers, the broads who work in the press are the hookers of the press. Need I explain that to you?
Later that evening, the press waited outside Sinatra's hotel, demanding answers. An ugly brawl erupted between Frank's bodyguards and several news cameramen. The situation was out of control.
You bastard! Who the bloody hell do you think you are?
Day 4. Sinatra woke up to a black ban. No member of an Australian union was permitted to service him, forcing the cancellation of his tour and stopping him from leaving the country. The unions demanded an apology, but Frank Sinatra refused to say sorry. When attempts at negotiations failed, Sinatra fled Melbourne, leaving Bob Hawke, the head of the trades unions and one of the most powerful men in Australia, standing on the tarmac. On day 5, Hawke flew to Sydney for a final showdown.
Press from all over the world were flying in, you know, from the Americas, from Europe. The loft, which is a large lounge area on the top of the hotel, was packed with hundreds of press.
Our story was, how is this going to end? I mean, he's black banned, unions are not going to touch him, he can't get fuel, he can't fly out of the country. So what's going to happen?
You had an international superego meeting Australian national superego, and they were both going to be probably going at it hammer and tongs.
It was front page in every newspaper, from the Times of London to the New York Times to the Los Angeles Times.
There were pickets around the hotel with signs, "Don't apologise." They were all pro Sinatra pickets. It was amazing
You're obviously a Sinatra fan.
Oh, yes, I do.
You think that he's been given a fairly tough go by the press, do you?
Yes, I do. I think they deliberately set out to provoke him when he arrived here. All he asked for was to be kept, his privacy kept. And they've not done it to him. They've harassed him everywhere he's gone.
Sinatra stayed true to his word, refusing to appear for the press. Instead, he sent his attorney to address the world's media.
Well, I want to make it clear now that while I think the press have, I won't say treated him unfairly, just dealt with a lot of nonsense and trivia, sort of a running game going about trying to take his picture. And because perhaps we won a few moves in that game, their noses were all out of joint.
Mickey gave a short, brief press release, and it basically said that Frank wasn't going to apologize and that he had nothing to apologize for.
We regret the incident, accept no culpability for the incident.
He won't apologise under any circumstance.
For what?
The people who were involved in this whole controversy, I doubt ever heard the actual monologue.
The radio stations put it out that if anybody had been to the show the night before and had recorded it, even if it was illegal, we were very keen to hear what that was said by Frank. And one or two people turned up at the hotel very kindly and offered up their tape.
Can we hear it, sir?
Yes. I don't care what you think about anybody, of any press in the world. I say they're bums, and they're always going to be bums. It's the scandal men that bug you and drive you crazy. And the hookers, the broads of the press, or the hookers of the press. You know, I explained this to you. And they're, I guess, in some fond hope that the well-known Australian sense of humor would pervade, said I might offer them $1.50. That's true. I once paid a broad in Washington $2, and I overpaid her.
I regard it as even more important than his comments, the action of those around him in causing physical injury, shoving people around and causing physical injury.
With no end in sight, Sinatra was still under siege at the Boulevard Hotel. Even though he snubbed Australia's union boss in Melbourne, Cranky Frankie must have realised this was the only man that could save him.
Sinatra's knight in shining armour galloping over the hill and meeting him at the boulevard was Hawke.
They were at a point where they started to come to realise they had a bit of a problem, and I made it clear that it could be resolved through discussion and negotiation. And so finally a meeting was set up at the boulevard, and I went up to the presidential suite.
Well, Bill, as you can see, the parasites of the press, including us, of course, are thronged outside the Boulevard Hotel, where momentous industrial decisions apparently are still being made between Mr. Sinatra's retinue and Bob Hawke.
Sinatra wasn't there to meet me. He had his lawyer there, a fairly tough US attorney type, pretty brash, and he was not in a very positive mood. And he said to me, well, you can't stop us leaving the country. And I said to him, well, as far as I know, there's only one case been recorded in the history of someone walking on water. And unless Frank is going to be the second one, I don't understand how you're going to get out, because you're not going to get out on a ship and you're not going to get out in an aeroplane. So I believe you're here, and you're here until you apologise. And it was at that stage he went off, and that's when Frank appeared.
Meanwhile, downstairs in the Royal Suite, several trade union delegates were being entertained.
We had the beer and the champagne flowing and the scotch and whatever they wanted, and the chicken sandwiches. And to be honest, they were getting pretty merry. One particular union person was swearing and cursing and pulling at this bottle of Chivas Regal scotch. And I said, you know, what's the matter, sir? And he's saying, I can't get the bloody top off this bottle. And of course, the bottle didn't have a top on it, it was open.
We have here the Acting Secretary of the Labour Council in New South Wales, Mr. John Ducker. Mr. Ducker, you've been a party to the talks, I take it. Is there any sort of compromise that's being bashed out? Do you expect, or are you demanding an apology from Sinatra? Does he look like he'll make one?
Look, compromises are not the name of the game. Mr. Sinatra is a international entertainer. He is a person who has got his own personality, which I think is pretty well known to all people.
Have you seen him tonight?
No, unfortunately not.
Has Mr. Hawke?
I hope so.
I met him and he said to me that he'd never had trouble with unions. He supported unions, and I said, well, that wasn't really the point, Frank. I said, your bodyguards behaved in a totally unacceptable fashion in pushing people around and causing injury, and quite apart from your offensive remarks. I said, you may be able to get away with that in the United States. You're not going to get away with it here.
I was just thinking that Hawke and Sinatra might get on pretty well. You know, they're both men of the world, aren't they?
Well, I don't know. I think Mr. Hawke is rather a reserved personality who leads a rather quiet, retired life.
So Sinatra on present form?
And, well, certainly at the present moment.
I think as a leader, Bob Hawke was a consensus man. He always prided himself in the ability to get people together and, if necessary, knock a few heads and say, come on, we need an outcome here.
So they went and had a natter and then came back and said, well, what do you want? I said, it's very simple. It's not complicated at all. I said, simply an apology.
This is a big one for Bob Hawke. He's no stranger, of course, to industrial tangles, but this will really test Hawke in the 4 or so years that he's been the top man with the ACTU, and he's still apparently locked in discussions with Sinatra.
He would get people together and he would thrash out solutions that allowed everybody to save face, and fundamentally that's what he did in this case.
They had a bit of a yarn and then they said, well, how do you want it? So I said, well, I'll draft something for you if you like. It's very simple. And so I made a couple of suggestions, and they went away and came back with something, and they said, is that all right? And I remember I just altered one word. I mean, they'd substantially agreed. I said, yeah, that's right. And so I shook hands with Frank, and that was it.
Mickey Rudin went down, read out the statement, and that was the end of the Black Band.
Frank Sinatra did not intend any general reflection upon the moral character of working members of the Australian media. Frank Sinatra also expresses his regret for any physical injury suffered by persons as a result of attempts to ensure his personal safety. After hours of negotiations and those few words, the black ban was lifted. The siege was over. The world breathed a sigh of relief. Sinatra was free to leave Australia, but stayed loyal to his fans. He went on to finish his show-stopping comeback tour, including a free telecast for those fans that missed his second Melbourne concert. When Old Blue Eyes flew out of Sydney, he left behind the legacy of one of the greatest entertainment scandals in history. Sinatra's contempt for the press had escalated into a catastrophe, the magnitude of which no one could have foreseen, and the world would never forget.
It was probably the most exciting week in my life, all the dramas that were happening, I must admit. And I've had some pretty interesting times in my life, but I'll tell you what, it was quite amazing, absolutely amazing.
As disastrous as it seemed at the time, and without any sleep and everything else that was going on, we still kept our sense of humour, which is sort of very Australian, I think. You know, we managed to, and most of all led by Frank.
I mean, you could look at it and say, you know, how on earth did this happen? But it was a hoot. You know, some of the best news stories you can have are great fun, and this was one of them.
I think one thing that I can remember, about 10 or 15 years later, he came back to Australia, and ironically, he held a press conference.
So I met you a few years ago, and you seem a much kinder, nicer man now.
A nicer man?
Well, Mel,
I don't know. I don't think I am an unnice man. It's just it's a matter of let's use this as an example. It's a matter of what kind of questions are asked. I've talked to the press many times until they get funny, and then it ends. I would like to have you join me and take a picture with me.
You all come behind me.
Come back.
Thank you very much.
And he actually had his photograph taken with them all, and, you know, had a completely different look on life as far as how to deal with the Australian media, if nothing else.
There's the UEFA Cup final live tomorrow at 7 here on ITV4. Up next though, Sinatra Night continues in Ocean